From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Going home for a while to treat my illness. I have every intention of returning here and giving many of you cause to regret all the nice things you said about me. And I hope to impress on you again that it is an honor to serve the American people in your company. Thank you, fellow senators.
Senator John McCain has died of brain cancer at the age of 81. We'll host a roundtable discussion on the former POW who became a 6-term senator and 2-time presidential candidate. We'll look at the obituaries and what's being omitted with The Intercept's Mehdi Hasan, Code Pink founder Medea Benjamin, and Norman Solomon, author of War Made Easy, How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death. Then we'll speak with Norman Solomon about how Democrats voted this weekend on a key progressive demand after the 2016 campaign to strip the power of superdelegates in choosing the party's presidential nominee.
We're ensuring the will of the grassroots determines our party's nominee by reducing the role that superdelegates have over our presidential nominating process. Now, superdelegates will refrain from voting on the first presidential nominating ballot, empowering the grassroots and removing any doubt about respecting the will of the people.
We go to Ireland, where Pope Francis marked the first papal visit to the country in 39 years by acknowledging the failure of church authorities to address child abuse crimes by the clergy.
The failure of ecclesiastical authorities, bishops, religious superiors, priests, and others, adequately to address these repugnant crimes has rightly given rise to outrage and remains a source of pain and of shame for the Catholic community.
We'll go to Dublin to speak with a member of SNAP, that's the Survivors Network of those abused by priests, and with a former priest and longtime supporter of clergy sex abuse victims. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Republican Arizona Senator John McCain has died at the age of 81. The senator and 2-time presidential candidate was battling a malignant brain tumor for over a year. On Friday, his family announced he was ending his treatment. He died Saturday afternoon at his home in Arizona. Senator McCain served as a naval pilot in the Vietnam War, spending 5 years as a prisoner of war after his plane was shot down in 1967. He spent 2 years in solitary confinement and twice attempted suicide. He eventually signed a statement he would forever regret, a confession admitting to, quote, crimes against the Vietnamese country and people. This experience made John McCain a lifelong opponent of torture. Yet upon his release and return to the United States, he wrote an article expressing support for President Nixon in the U.S. bombing of Cambodia. After McCain's election to the U.S. Senate in 1987, he consistently promoted war and U.S. military intervention abroad, including in the first Gulf War, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In 2008, McCain ran for president, vowing to deploy a surge of U.S. troops to Iraq. McCain was also known for reaching across the aisle and working with Democrats on some key issues. In 1995, he worked with John Kerry, a Vietnam War veteran who opposed the Vietnam War, to provide political cover for President Clinton to normalize relations with Vietnam. Last year, McCain famously voted thumbs down against the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. He also recently opposed CIA Director Gina Haspel's nomination because of her role in post-9/11 torture. Former Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama will eulogize McCain at his funeral at the National Cathedral on Saturday. CNN's reported McCain did not want President Trump to attend. We'll have more on McCain's political legacy after headlines. In Chicago, Democratic Party officials voted Saturday to vastly reduce the power of superdelegates in choosing the Democratic Party's presidential nominee. The new rules voted on at the National Committee's summer meeting will prohibit superdelegates from voting on the first ballot of the presidential nominating process at the party's convention. The change comes after the highly contentious role of superdelegates during the 2016 Democratic Democratic primary between former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. We'll have more on the Democratic Party vote and superdelegates later in the broadcast. Pope Francis traveled to Ireland, where he met with survivors of sexual abuse by Catholic priests and acknowledged the grave scandal of church sexual abuse. It was the first papal visit to Ireland since 1979. This is Paul Redman, one of the abuse survivors who met with Pope Francis.
We're looking for unqualified, wholehearted apologies. And certainly we got one today from the Pope, but whether that will translate into a huge official apology from the Church is another matter. But it's whether that translates into actual actions. That's what really matters to us. That's what really matters to us and to survivors around the world and to 1.2 billion Catholics around the world who are desperate to see their own church actually finally just confess and atone for their sins, and it's long overdue.
Pope Francis himself is now facing calls to resign after a former top-ranking Vatican official released a 7,000-word letter Sunday claiming the Pope knew about allegations of sex abuse by high-ranking Cardinal Theodore McCarrick but failed to punish him. Pope Francis has refused to comment on the accusations. We'll have more on the Pope's visit to Ireland later in the broadcast. The Trump administration says it's cutting more than $200 million in aid to the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinian leaders are denouncing the move, accusing the Trump administration of weaponizing humanitarian aid. This is Wassel Abu Youssef of the Palestine Liberation Organization.
The United States of America and President Trump's administration is blackmailing and putting pressure on the Palestinian people. This decision cuts the aid, including the last $200 million. We were completely expecting it under the policy of blackmailing and threatening that the United States of America practices, and in the context of passing what is called the deal of the century.
The cuts to humanitarian aid comes after the Trump administration already withheld $65 million in funding for UNRWA, the UN agency that provides humanitarian aid to Palestinians. They cut that earlier this year. The United Nations has issued a new report calling for Burma's top military generals to be investigated for genocide against Rohingya Muslims. This is Christopher Sidoti, a member of the independent fact-finding mission.
The fact-finding mission has concluded on reasonable grounds that the patterns of gross human rights violations and serious violations of international humanitarian law that it has found amount to the gravest crimes under international law. These have principally been committed by the military, the Tatmadaw. The mission has concluded that criminal investigation and prosecution is warranted, focusing on the top Tatmadaw generals in relation to the three categories of crimes under international law: genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes.
Meanwhile, a Burmese court has postponed the verdicts against two Reuters journalists charged with violating Burma's Official Secrets Act. At the time of their arrest, Chaw So-u and Walon were investigating a massacre committed by the Burmese military targeting Rohingya Muslims in the village of Indin nearly a year ago. They're facing up to 14 years in prison. Their verdict will now be announced on September 3rd. In Afghanistan, authorities say the head of ISIS in Afghanistan was killed in an airstrike in Nangarhar province Saturday night. Abu Saad Erhabi and 10 other members of ISIS were reportedly killed in the airstrikes carried out by the Afghan military and U.S.-led coalition forces. In more news from Afghanistan, a suicide bombing outside an election commission office in the eastern city of Jalalabad killed at least 7 people on Saturday. In Argentina, a corruption scandal has engulfed the country as prosecutors investigate an alleged kickback scheme involving government contracts under former President Nestor Kirchner and his widow and successor, President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. Authorities have already arrested more than 24 people and raided the home of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. She says the investigation is a political ploy by the right-wing administration of the current Argentine President Mauricio Macri, and she's compared her situation to the prosecution and jailing of Brazil's former president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil. Back in the United States, in Jacksonville, Florida, authorities say a man opened fire at a restaurant hosting a Madden 19 video game tournament Sunday, killing 3 people, including himself, and wounding 11 more. A warning, this video is disturbing.
It's going to be hard to get them on stream. It's not a tough out today. Excuse me, not an easy out. Oh.
Oh, what are you shooting with? Oh.
This video was streamed live. Authorities say the shooter was a 24-year-old man named David Katz from Baltimore. Sunday's shooting occurred only 2 days after another shooting in Jacksonville, Florida, at a high school football game. 1 person was killed and 2 more were wounded in that shooting. Across the United States, a prison strike continues nationwide as prisoners demand better food, fair pay for work, and an end to what they call modern-day slavery. On Saturday, protesters gathered outside Lee Correctional Institution in South Carolina to demand better living conditions for prisoners detained inside. 7 prisoners died during a riot at this prison in April. Meanwhile, at least 6 people are continuing a hunger strike inside the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington.
My name is Murat Azaniev. I'm on a hunger strike 4 days, on a dry hunger strike. I don't drink, I don't eat because of my medical issue. I'm 8 months here in Tacoma, a little bit more in USA.
On Saturday, about 100 students and protesters gathered at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for competing rallies near the site where the students toppled the Silent Sam Confederate statue a week ago, a night before classes began. During Saturday's protests, a handful of white supremacists marched with Confederate flags, while a much larger group of anti-racist protesters celebrated the removal of the Confederate statue and shouted, "Nazis go home." 7 people were arrested. This is University of North Carolina doctoral student Maya Little speaking on Democracy Now! Last week. She helped spark the movement to topple the Confederate statue when she poured red ink and her own blood on the monument during an earlier protest in April.
What is actually unlawful and disrespectful is forcing black students to study on a campus with buildings named after slave owners, to study on a campus in which the forefront was a memorial to the people who enslaved their ancestors, who continued to disenfranchise, murder, and commit violence towards them in the 1920s and during Jim Crow.
To see the whole interview with Maya Little, go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show looking back at the life and legacy of John McCain, the 6-term senator and 2-time presidential candidate who died Saturday at the age of 81 of breast cancer at his home in Arizona, of brain cancer. John McCain began his decades-long political career after he was a naval pilot in the Vietnam War, where he spent more than 5 years as a prisoner of war after his plane was shot down in Hanoi in 1967. He spent 2 years in solitary confinement and twice attempted suicide. He eventually would sign a statement that he would regret, that was a so-called confession admitting to, quote, crimes against the Vietnamese country and people. This experience made him a lifelong opponent of torture. As recently as May, McCain opposed the Trump administration's nomination of Gina Haspel as director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Haspel's a 33-year CIA veteran who was responsible for running a secret CIA black site in Thailand in 2002, where at least 1 prisoner was waterboarded and tortured in other ways during her tenure. Yet in 1973, upon McCain's release from being a prisoner of war and his return to the United States, he wrote an article expressing support for President Nixon and the U.S. bombing of Cambodia. After McCain's election to the U.S. Senate in 1987, he consistently promoted war and U.S. military intervention abroad, including in the first Gulf War, Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as Iran. Here is Senator McCain joking about bombing Iran at a 2007 campaign event during his presidential bid against Barack Obama.
that old Beach Boys song, Bomberan? Bom, 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 bom. Anyway.
In 2008, John McCain ran for president, vowing to deploy a surge of U.S. troops to Iraq. He failed to win the election and faced criticism for his choice of Alaska Governor Sarah Palin as his running mate, who some say paved the way for the election of Donald Trump. Senator McCain was also known for reaching across the aisle and working with Democrats on key issues. In 1995, he worked with John Kerry, a fellow Vietnam War veteran, but Kerry had opposed the war, to provide political cover for President Clinton to normalize relations with Vietnam. Last year, McCain made headlines when he came back to the Senate and voted thumbs down against the Republican-led repeal of the Affordable Care Act. After McCain's death, the Washington Post reports President Trump rejected issuing a White House statement praising McCain. Instead, he tweeted, "My deepest sympathies and respect go out to the family of Senator John McCain. Our hearts and prayers are with you," unquote. Former Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush will deliver eulogies at McCain's funeral at the National Cathedral on Saturday. McCain's family has asked Trump not attend the service. For more, we're joined by three guests. In Washington, D.C., Mehdi Hasan is with us, columnist for The Intercept, host of their Deconstructed podcast. He's also host of Up Front at Al Jazeera English. He's been tweeting in response to McCain's death. He wrote a piece there last year, headlined, "Despite what the press says, Maverick McCain has a long and distinguished record of horribleness." Also in Washington is Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink. And here in New York, we're joined by Norman Solomon, national coordinator of Roots Action. He's also executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy, author of War Made Easy, How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death, among other books. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Norman, let's begin with you. Your response to, well, the death of Senator McCain, his life and his legacy.
It's really natural to have a lot of empathy for someone who suffered through brain cancer, admiration for people who withstood great hardships with pride and determination. However, what we've seen is really what could be called the phenomenon of obit-omit, obituaries that are flagrantly in conflict with the real historical record. And when you stop and think about it, you know, journalism is supposed to be the first draft of history. And when history is falsified in the way that we're getting in the last couple of days now, several days really, in the lead up to Senator McCain's death, it's really a kind of a fraudulence on the part of the U.S. mass media. If John McCain was a maverick, it's only a high jump over very low standards. And while there were certainly some, from a progressive standpoint, admirable characteristics that he had, he also was a huge enthusiast for war, which included after his return from being a prisoner in Vietnam.
Mehdi Hasan, your reflection on the career of John McCain, who died this weekend at his home in Arizona of brain cancer.
I think Norman's right to point to the obit-omit phenomenon. I think that's one of the things I've taken away from the past couple of days, just watching some of the media coverage, which is less journalism and more hagiography. We know what McCain was good at and what he was praised for, but we're not hearing about some of the darker sides of his political record. And there's nothing wrong with bringing some light to the darker parts of a politician's, a public figure's record. This is not some sort of dancing on his grave. This is talking about what he did. And, you know, look at his career. He was a man who was involved in a massive financial scandal in the late 1980s. He was part of the Keating Five, the savings and loan scandal. He agitated, as you mentioned, Amy, in your introduction, for the illegal and catastrophic invasion and occupation of Iraq. Never apologized, never showed any regret for that. In 2008, he ran a nasty, desperate and bigoted campaign for the presidency of the United States alongside Sarah Palin, which, as you pointed out again, did pave the way for the election of Donald Trump and for Trumpism in 2016. These are things he should be held to account for. You also mentioned his famous and welcome vote, last-minute vote, I should add, against Obamacare last year. Sorry, in defense of Obamacare, saving Obamacare in a way last year. But we don't talk about his vote for the big Trump tax cuts, which also involved the killing of the Obamacare individual mandate. He was not a maverick, as Norman says. He was a maverick in name only.
Medea Benjamin, you had direct experience with Senator McCain, your organization, your co-founder of Code Pink.
Yes, we had constantly been lobbying John McCain to not support all these wars. Amy, I think it's so horrible to be calling somebody a war hero because he participated in the bombing of Vietnam. I just spent the last weekend with Veterans for Peace, people who are atoning for their sins in Vietnam by trying to stop new wars. John McCain hasn't done that. With his life, what he did was support wars from not only Iraq, but also Libya. He called John Kerry delusional for trying to make a nuclear deal with Iran. And so threw his lot in with the MEK, the extremist group in Iran. He also was a good friend of Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis. There was a gala for the Saudis in May when the Crown Prince was visiting, and they had a special award for John McCain. He supported the Saudi bombing in Yemen that has been so catastrophic. And I think we have to think that those who have participated in war are really heroes if they spend the rest of their lives trying to stop war, not like John McCain, who spent the rest of his life supporting war.
Norman Solomon.
And we really have to fault the mass media of the United States, not just for the last few days, but the last decades, pretending that somehow, by implication, almost that John McCain was doing the people of North Vietnam a favor as he flew over them and dropped bombs. You would think in the hagiography that we've been getting about his role in a squadron flying over North Vietnam that he was dropping, flowers or marshmallows or something. He was shot down during his 23rd mission, dropping bombs on massive numbers of human beings in a totally illegal and immoral war.
I wanted to turn to President Trump as candidate in 2016 when he attacked John McCain.
Somebody should run against John McCain, who has been, in my opinion, not so hot. And I supported him. I supported him for president. I raised $1 million for him. It's a lot of money. I supported him. He lost. He let us down. But, he lost. So I never liked him as much after that because I don't like losers. But Frank, let me get to it. He hit me. He's not a war hero. He's a war hero. He's a war hero. 5.5 years. He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you.
Mehdi Hasan, I like people who weren't captured, says now President Trump.
I mean, what are your views of John McCain? It was a disgraceful remark from a draft-dodging then-presidential candidate Donald Trump. But let's be clear, the Trump-McCain rivalry animosity, which the media have been focusing on a lot, especially this morning with the flags back at full staff at the White House, and, this Washington Post report about Trump refusing to call him a hero and changing the statement and not saying anything positive about McCain. I mean, look, that is Donald Trump being the petty man-child that we know he is. And in fact, John McCain benefited from the fact that Donald Trump hated him because it made him even more popular with the media, who could play this. The media loves, rows and personalities and disagreements. So the idea of McCain being this anti-Trump figure was great for them. And Trump and McCain obliged by giving them great rhetoric attacking Trump. But when you look at the record, if you look at the actual voting record that 538 put together, McCain voted with Trump 80% of the time since 2016. He wasn't some great rebel in actions. The thing about John McCain was he was great at rhetoric. The actions didn't always match the rhetoric, and that is what the media gave him cover for. Norman's right. The media have a lot to answer for when it comes to McCain. McCain cultivated the media. A lot of reporters on Twitter over the last couple of days have been saying he was their friend, which is a weird phrase to use for a politician. And McCain himself called the media my base. That's how he got his reputation as a maverick. That's how he's getting all this hagiographical coverage right now on the cable news channels from right and left alike.
I'd like to go back to 2015, when then Senate Armed Services Committee Chair, Senator John McCain, lashed out at Code Pink protesters who were calling for former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to be arrested for war crimes. Our guest, Medea Benjamin, was one of the protesters whose voice is clearly audible.
In the name of the people of Cambodia, in the name of the people of Laos. I did. I was right there. I'd like to say to my colleagues and to our distinguished witnesses this morning that I've been a member of this committee for many years, and I have never seen anything as disgraceful and outrageous and despicable as the last demonstration that just took place about, you know, you're going to have to shut up or I'm going to have you arrested. If we can't get the Capitol Hill police in here immediately, get out of here, you low-life scum.
That was Senator McCain in 2015. Medea, I heard your voice a little time before that talking about holding Kissinger accountable for the people of Laos and Cambodia.
Well, the question is, why would John McCain bring in Henry Kissinger as an expert to tell us how we should move forward with U.S. foreign policy? From the time that in the late 90s, John McCain threw his lot in with the Project for the New American Century and the neocons, John McCain has been looking towards people who see militarism and U.S. intervention and the U.S. right to overthrow other governments as his ticket, I would say, for his personal ambitions. And I think really calling us low-life scum instead of looking at the record of Henry Kissinger, or let's just look at the record of John McCain himself and say these are not the people that we should be lionizing.
What's interesting about that exchange, Amy, is not just the whole defense of Kissinger and a militarized foreign policy, but the language used. Here are anti-war protesters in the Senate using their democratic right to protest, and he calls them low-life scum. And yet we're being told for the last 48 hours that John McCain was the embodiment of civility in U.S. politics. He was a bastion of decency. Even Bernie Sanders used that phrase. And yet even McCain himself probably wouldn't recognize that description. He was a well-known cranky and rude and abusive figure. He called anti-war protesters low-life scum. He mocked Chelsea Clinton as ugly. He made jokes about rape and spousal abuse. He famously called his Vietnamese captors gooks and said, "I won't apologize for that." He used the C word against his wife in public. He has a long history of not behaving in a civil manner. He ran a presidential campaign in 2008, Amy, where at the rallies of McCain and Palin, people shouted out, "Terrorist, traitor, off with his head, kill him," in reference to Barack Obama. Today we condemn Donald Trump for holding rallies where they say, "Lock her up." Where is the condemnation of those rallies in 2008 that John McCain presided over?
I want to turn to John McCain in 2008, as you're describing. But this was in New Hampshire at a town hall meeting when he defended his presidential opponent, Barack Obama, his rival, in the face of constituents spouting racist conspiracy theories. This is a clip.
I've got to ask you a question. I do not I can't trust Obama. I have read about him, and he's an Arab. He is not. No,
ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about. He's not.
There are so many levels to address this on, Mehdi Hasan, if you could start.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been thinking about this clip a lot for the last couple of days. It's gone viral. It's had millions of views on Twitter, and it's being held up by a lot of people as, you know, McCain's moment of nobility in 2008, where he defended Barack Obama, compared to Donald Trump, of course, who spread Bertha conspiracies about Obama being a secret Muslim. And, you know, some of us have criticized that. I've always found that clip uncomfortable, to say the least, because even if you give John McCain the benefit of the doubt and say it was a spur-of-the-moment, off-the-cuff response to the woman, he didn't address her point that Obama was an Arab. There is this weird disjunction where she says he's an Arab and he says, no, he's a decent family man, which seems to say that, well, hold on, are Arabs not decent family men? Now, McCain defenders would say, no, he wasn't referring to the Arab point. He was preempting her line about she was going to say he was a terrorist or a non-citizen. But the point is, there was that prejudice already back then in 2008, well before Donald Trump, in the Republican base, this animosity towards Muslims, towards Arabs, towards foreigners. And John McCain never took the opportunity, certainly not in that exchange, to question the underlying bigoted premise, in the way that Colin Powell did, for example, at the same time. He went on TV at the same time, Powell, and he said, look, is Barack Obama an Arab or a Muslim? No, he's not. But so what if he is? That "so what if he is" was never said by John McCain. In fact, John McCain ran a campaign in 2008, which, again, I'll say it again, we keep forgetting and airbrushing, in which Obama was presented to the American people as a terrorist, as a friend of terrorists. That's outrageous.
Norman Solomon.
Well, there's a spectrum of problems here. I mean, if you go to the broader one that Mehdi was just talking about, we've had a whole history from George W. Bush through Barack Obama to Hillary Clinton of people saying, oh, we support Muslims. Muslims are part of the American family, while those same leaders are slaughtering Muslims in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Iraq, and hoping to do it in many cases elsewhere in the Middle East. So this whole notion that you say a few platitudes and that justifies your militaristic and really mass murderous, truly, foreign policy is a problem. When you get to that specific clip, which has gotten huge play in the last 48 hours. The reality is that even more disturbing than the off-the-cuff response from Senator McCain is the approach from the mass media of the United States, which seems clueless. Just it's an irony-free zone, absolutely not addressing what the real message or a key part of that message was, which is if you're an Arab, then you're not a decent family man. But if you're a decent family man, then, oh, no, you're not really an Arab. What an ugly, corrosive, and truly racist message that is.
And the significance of the major funeral memorial at the National Cathedral this weekend, that President Bush will eulogize McCain, President Obama will eulogize McCain, and people are now saying that McCain made clear he didn't even want Trump there.
Yes, well, Trump is another brand of militaristic foreign policy that I think has to be opposed just as much as the particular brand that his buddy Lindsey Graham and McCain himself embodied. There's been a lot of coverage in the Washington Post and elsewhere in the last day bemoaning that with McCain gone, the traditional militarism from the Pentagon and the CIA and so forth won't be as strong against Trump. And it's simply, in a way, a falling out between McDonald's and Burger King. These two factions of the Republican Party are both so vicious and so militaristic, embodying what Dr. King called the madness of militarism.
And what's so really ironic about the whole kind of McCain-Trump split on policy, when it comes to foreign policy, the Trump administration is the most hawkish administration we've ever seen when it comes to Iran. We're seeing them now ramping up efforts to target Iran in terms of breaking out of the Iran deal, in terms of appointing this new office at the State Department to keep an eye on Iran. You've got Iran hawks at every level of the Trump administration. If Donald Trump in future years, God forbid, does go to war with Iran, well, if John McCain had been alive, he'd be egging Donald Trump Trump on. We know that. We saw the clip at the beginning of the show where he was singing jokingly about bombing Iran. So, yeah, I think Norman's spot on to say, the actual difference is there when it comes to the mass murderous foreign policy between a Trump and a McCain. Not that much.
And the fact right now the White House is flying its flag at full staff, whereas in places like the Washington Monument, they have them lowered. Medea, the New York Times 538 reports McCain voting with Trump 83% of the time.
Well, that's right. I think we should really look at this in the larger context of the glorification of militarism, the way McCain was in favor of the expansion of NATO, threatening towards both China and Russia. This is all in the benefit of the weapons industry. We can see Lockheed Martin doing a eulogy, which they did for John McCain. So let's remember, we want to thank those who don't fight in wars, the conscientious objectors, the peacemakers, and recognize John McCain as a symbol of the glorification of military that we have to fight against.
I want to thank you all for being with us. Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink. Mehdi Hasan is with The Intercept, where he hosts the Deconstructed podcast. And Norman Solomon with Roots Action Institute for Public Accuracy. Norman, I'd like to ask you to stay with us to learn about this, well, epic vote in the Democratic Party this weekend to strip superdelegates of some of their power. Stay with us. Your Hand in Mine by Explosions in the Sky. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to the future of the Democratic Party. After a major debate, Democrats have voted on a key progressive demand after the 2016 campaign to vastly reduce the power of superdelegates in choosing the party's presidential nominee. The vote passed to a huge ovation and cheers on Saturday.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes overwhelmingly have it, and the report and the charge, the call, is adopted.
Saturday's vote of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee in Chicago, officially barred the superdelegates from voting on the first ballot to choose the party's presidential nominee unless a candidate has secured a majority of the convention using only pledged delegates whose votes are earned during the primary process. The vote to limit the influence of superdelegates comes after the 2016 race for Democratic nominee between Senator Bernie Sanders and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. It pitted many DNC members who supported the change against two former party chairs and members of the Congressional Black Caucus. For more, we're joined by someone who was there for what DNC Chair Tom Perez is calling a historic vote. Norman Solomon, national coordinator of Roots Action, a Bernie Sanders delegate from California to the 2016 Democratic National Convention, where he coordinated the Independent Bernie Delegates Network, also executive director of Institute for Policy for Public Accuracy.
It was historic and very exciting not only to be in the room when that vote was taken, but in the days ahead of that vote, out with people from my colleagues at rootsaction.org, Progressive Democrats of America and elsewhere, picketing with that message that really is the gist. Democratic Party, live up to your name. And this was, I think, a tremendous victory that came not from the top, out of the goodness of any hearts of those at the pinnacle of power of the Democratic Party, but from the base, the grassroots, people who have been angry, who have been organizing, especially in the last 2 years, to say that superdelegate power and leverage over the nomination process has to go.
I want to go to former DNC chair Don Fowler, describing his opposition to restricting the power of superdelegates, speaking during an interview with the Chicago Sun-Times.
We're going to prohibit 200 African Americans, 100 Latinos, dozens of LGBTQ people, and others from voting. We're taking the vote away from these people.
This is former interim Democratic National Committee Chair Donna Brazile describing her opposition to curbing the power of superdelegates in an interview with the Chicago Sun-Times.
The question is whether or not automatic or so-called superdelegates, and there's nothing super about us, will be able to vote on the first ballot. The position of many in the party is that we deserve, those of us who are unpledged delegates, we deserve to have a voice in the process. And whether it's at the table with a vote or behind the scenes, raising money for candidates or taking candidates around, we believe that automatic delegates should continue to play a role because we're part of the sauce. We're part of the sauce for victory.
That was former interim DNC Chair Donna Brazile speaking after the vote that she opposed. Norman Solomon, talk about this victory and how you organized for it, and the fact that Tom Perez, the chairman of the DNC, voted with you.
Yes, frankly, Tom Perez, the chair of the DNC, was dragged kicking and screaming, but ultimately very effectively to advocate for this, I think, very profound change. It should be said that the organization Our Revolution did a tremendous job in the last 2 years, working inside and outside the Democratic Party to help organize this tremendous change. And a year ago, 6 months ago, it seemed virtually impossible to get such a clean sweep in terms of superdelegate power. What we heard from Donna Brazile there and Don Fowler was the anger of the old guard, losing their grip on power, losing their ability to put their thumbs on the scale. It is a new day. We're getting socialists elected to Congress through the Democratic Party primaries. We've got to keep organizing and fighting. Let's be clear, this is a victory for the grassroots, for progressives, but it's only a beginning. We have a long, steep mountain to climb, and we got to keep pushing.
But for people, especially outside this country, but I think inside this country as well, who just don't get what superdelegates are, explain exactly what happened. What power did you strip them? What power did they have?
Yeah, the gist is that superdelegates were 15% of the total Democratic National Convention to choose the presidential nominee. And those superdelegates were not elected for the purpose of or in designation from voters as to who the nominee should be. They were kingmakers. They had power apart from any Democratic, lowercase d, accountability, and they loved it. Every Democrat in Congress, every Democratic governor, Democratic Party officials, and they liked having candidates go to them hat in hand. Will you endorse me? Will you support me? Will you pledge your vote? And those advanced pledges were a huge boost to Hillary Clinton, not just 15% of the votes, but from the starting line, she was way ahead.
I mean, something that just infuriated not only Bernie Sanders supporters, but others, even, I think, Hillary Clinton supporters. At the very beginning, before the primaries, they were talking about they have wrapped up the superdelegate support, so they have won. So people who are going to go out to vote at all these primaries are saying, then why are we going out to vote?
Before a single ballot was cast in a Democratic primary or caucus, Hillary Clinton had more than half of the superdelegate votes, and that allowed the cable channels to run on their lower part of the screen. Hillary Clinton way ahead as the front runner. And an analogy would be, let's say you have two contestants in a race. The gun goes off, but at that moment, one of the racers is way ahead, and that is because of superdelegates. And not only that, by being way ahead at the start, then the nutrients, the vitamins, the water, in the form of funding and media momentum, is already given to that person, whereas in this case, Bernie Sanders was still the starting line.
And now you have President Trump.
Now we have President Trump, who has to be defeated, and progressives have this dual necessity to fight the right, the xenophobes, the racists, and let's be clear, in November, we can only defeat them through Democratic Party candidates to take back the House and hopefully even the Senate, but also to fight like hell for progressive principles because, let's face it as well, the Democratic Party is controlled by people who are part of the military-industrial intelligence complex, and they won't give it up without a big fight ahead.
We're going to leave it there, but of course we continue to cover this right through the midterm elections and beyond. Norman Solomon, National Coordinator of RootsAction.org. When we come back from break, we go to Dublin, where Pope Francis marked the first papal visit to Ireland in 39 years by acknowledging the failure of church authorities to address child abuse crimes by the clergy. Stay with us. Church. Sinead O'Connor here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show in Ireland, where Pope Francis marked the first papal visit to the country in 39 years by acknowledging the failure by church authorities to address child abuse crimes by the clergy.
The failure of ecclesiastical authorities, bishops, religious superiors, priests, and others adequately to address these repugnant crimes has rightly given rise to outrage and remains a source of pain and of shame for the Catholic community.
While in Ireland, Pope Francis also asked for forgiveness for the scandal and betrayal felt by victims of sexual exploitation by Catholic clergy.
In my prayer before Mary's statue, I presented to her in particular all the victims of abuse of whatever kind committed by members of the Church in Ireland. None of us can fail to be moved by the stories of young people who suffered abuse, who were robbed of their innocence, and left scarred by painful memories.
But Sunday, Pope Francis faced a new bombshell accusation from a former top-ranking Vatican official who called on him to resign, who called on the Pope to resign, releasing a 7,000-word letter claiming the Pope knew about allegations of sex abuse by the high-ranking Cardinal Theodore McCarrick of D.C. years before they became public and failed to punish him. McCarrick faces allegations he coerced men training to become priests into sexual relationships and abused a teenage altar boy. Pope Francis has refused to comment on the accusations. For more, we go to Dublin, Ireland, where we're joined by two guests. Peter Isley is a survivor of childhood sexual assault by a Wisconsin priest, a founding member of SNAP. That's Survivors Network of those abused by priests. He traveled from Wisconsin to Ireland for the Pope's visit. And Thomas Doyle is also with us, former priest, longtime supporter of justice and compassion for clergy sex abuse victims. In 1985, he wrote the policy for bishops to handle sexual abuse. They ignored it. He was expert witness in the grand jury proceedings in Pennsylvania's grand jury report on sexual abuse of children by Catholic clergy members that came out a few weeks ago. They're both part of the organization Ending Clergy Abuse. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! While you're both from the United States, you're both in Dublin. Peter, explain what the significance of this weekend and the Pope's first visit in 39 years to Ireland and what he said to sex abuse survivors.
Well, the importance of him coming here was the opportunity he had, which was an incredible opportunity to come here and tell the world not just that he feels bad about sexual abuse of children, because I think we all know he feels pretty bad about it, but what he's going to do about it. And that he didn't tell us. And so we're leaving Ireland, and once again, we have absolutely no idea what he's going to do. And the record on what he's done is not good at all. And I think for survivors and for everybody, We're way past the time where feeling bad about it, which is fine, feeling bad about it is okay. Now we've got to move on to what you're going to do about it. And you can see from the chaos that's going on with the former papal nuncio, there's so much confusion and so much chaos right now. You can see really the culture that needs to be changed. It's the Vatican culture. And I don't know what confidence anyone can have in this management team that has covered up child sex crimes and continues to cover it up around the world, that they're somehow going to fix it. They're not going to fix it. Somebody else needs to fix it. And that's why we need grand juries like Pennsylvania all over the United States, governmental commissions like Australia and elsewhere to intervene on behalf of children around the world and do what they're supposed to do, which is to investigate child sex crimes.
Pope Francis met with 8 Irish survivors of clerical, religious and institutional abuse, including Paul Redmond, who said Francis spoke Spanish during the meeting and condemned corruption and cover-up within the church as caca, a Spanish word for human excrement.
Other people took a turn then, and he came back at the end and apologised to all of us for what had happened to us. And the thing that really shocked us all was when he was talking to survivors about cover-up and corruption in Rome itself. He literally referred to these people as caca. And his translator, again, was kind of shocked and asked the Pope to clarify. And the Pope literally did some hand gestures and said, caca, they are filth in a toilet. And he literally called these people. And we were stunned with that, and we felt that was a really important thing for him to do in the face of not just what happened in Ireland, but in the face of what's happening around the world and the grand jury in Pennsylvania, obviously, last week. That was a huge movement for the church, and I hope this is the start of something new within the church. There's been a lot of false dawns, there's been a lot of empty promises and a lot of talk.
So one of the people who was in the meeting with the Pope, Thomas Doyle, you founded Ending Clergy Abuse. You're a priest. You've been recommending for decades what the church should do. What is your response to what the Pope said and what you think needs to happen?
Well, first off, I was not in the meeting with the Pope. Secondly, I did not found Ending Clergy Abuse. I'm a member, but I did not found it. But I can give you my response to what he said, and it's just more talk. I don't care what he says. I've been involved in this now for over 30 years and heard, every which way from Sunday. They apologize, they make excuses and everything else. Well, it's time for that, way past time for that to end and something concrete to be done, because the problem still exists. A number have said, and reflecting on these 30 years, is that they just don't get it, and they're not going to get it. So where the progress is going to happen isn't by the church or by the hierarchy. It's going to happen in the courts in the United States and in other countries where they're facing a power they cannot control. And that power, such as in the state of Pennsylvania, is speaking loudly, and they will make moves and things will happen that will force the church to act appropriately. And that's the only way it's going to happen. They're not going to do it on their own. It's got to be forced.
Can you talk about, Thomas Doyle, what is happening now with the attack on the Pope by the, as he called the Papal Nuncio, the former Vatican ambassador to Washington, D.C., who's now openly turned against the Pope and said he should resign?
Well, I read the letter, and I've known for some time that there are some fairly vocal and strong opponents to the reforms that Francis wants to bring about in a number of areas. I see the letter as primarily political, and they used the sexual abuse issue to float that boat. So I'm really not all that concerned about that. That's political. That's going to probably burn itself out before too long, although there'll be a lot of rhetoric about it. And I find it a bit offensive that it was a distraction from the real issue, which is the worldwide sexual abuse that's still going on and needs much more than apologies and nonsense of that nature.
Peter Isley, I'm sorry, I said Father Thomas Doyle had founded Ending Clergy Abuse, but it was you. Is that right?
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
So I wanted to...
I mean, he could have been a founder.
So I wanted to ask you about the latest news that Missouri is investigating, like Pennsylvania did, clergy abuse of children. Also, you have said that the priesthood is the only occupation in civil society where you can rape and sexually assault children and remain within your occupation. Explain and tell us what are the steps that you need to happen now.
Sure. Well, first of all, survivors are incredibly cheered, as everybody should, that finally, in places like Missouri, because I can tell you there's been an immense amount of harm to children over the decades in Missouri by predator priests, and there has been a lot of cover-up, as there has been everywhere around the world. Every diocese and religious order, and states are cut up into different dioceses, religious orders are cross-geographical, has a mountain of documents detailing the sexual abuse of children, as we saw in Pennsylvania, and the cover-up of those crimes. And it's no good for them having those documents. We need to see those documents. And I'm telling you, in every diocese around the world, that's criminal evidence. That's direct criminal evidence of child sex crimes and the cover-up of child sex crimes. What I was referring to about that comment, okay, and there's some change in the United States with church law, but for the rest of the world, under their own law, and this is the problem, and we've continually been saying this to Pope Francis and the Vatican, but they already know it. Under their law, you can sexually abuse and assault a child, and you can remain a priest, and you can remain, if your bishop wants you to, working with children and families. Now, do you know any other occupation on earth that you can do that? That's why what Pope Francis has to do, that's why what he needed to do when he was here in Ireland, and he needed to do this already, he needed to do this a long time ago, was two things. One, he has to write into church law, zero tolerance. There is not zero tolerance in the Catholic Church for child sexual abuse by clergy that have been known to abuse children. Zero tolerance does not exist in their law, so it doesn't exist. So that's number one. Any priest, any cleric, any religious order person that has been found to have sexually assaulted or abused a child at any time has to be removed from the ministry and probably from the priesthood. So that's number one. Number two, zero tolerance for any bishop that has been proven, and I'm telling you, all the proof is in those documents, that has been proven to have covered up for a child sex crime. Here's a simple axiom of justice. It's not okay to cover up for child sex crimes. Let's start with that. And you should be removed from your position of authority as a bishop. Now, the Pope is here, and Cardinal Wuerl in Washington, guess what? He's still a cardinal. He covered up for child sex crimes in Pittsburgh. He went on national television 2 days before that grand jury report came out, and he knew full well what was in that report, as the Vatican did, and how could Pope Francis not know it? And he went on national television, and he was asked, did you transfer one of these priests, one of these abuser priests? And he said, that was not my process. In other words, no, I didn't do it. And then there it all is, all the proof, one of the worst predators in Pittsburgh. And so what does he do? There's his signature directly on a letter to that predator. I'm going to transfer you out of my diocese because I know you've raped and sexually assaulted children for years, and he knows it, and I'm going to put you into Reno, Nevada. Now, that man's still the Cardinal of Washington, D.C. So what else do you need to know with what is profoundly wrong with this system? He's got to make that into church law, period. You can't have zero tolerance about abuser priests if you have tolerance for bishops that cover up for child sex crimes. Because why would they remove those predator priests that they've been covering up for?
20 seconds. Father Thomas Doyle, what's happening in Chile? Very quickly.
In Chile, there's an awareness on the part of the lay people about the corruption on the part of the church hierarchy. They're making their anger known. They're making their anger known not only about the sexual abuse
demanding
area
all
of
bishops
corruption,
resign.
but in all areas of corruption. The Pope demanded all the bishops resign. He's accepted the resignations, I think, of 5 or 6. And so that process is going on right now. He's trying to clean that up.
We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank Thomas Doyle and Peter Isley. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.